The cold metallic click echoed in the brightly lit, sterile lobby, a sound so final it seemed to sever the air. It was the sound of handcuffs locking around Dr. Camille Johnson's wrists. The shock was a physical blow, cold and sharp, radiating from the steel biting into her skin. She stared, first at the officer whose face was a mask of bored indifference, then down at her own hospital ID, dangling uselessly from the waistband of her scrubs. Her name, her title, head of surgery, seemed like a cruel joke printed on a flimsy piece of plastic. Her voice, a voice that commanded operating rooms and soothed terrified families, was a quiet, strained whisper. "I work here." The officer's reply was a dismissive sigh, the verbal equivalent of a shrug. "That's what they all say, ma'am." The cuffs were cold, a stark, brutal contrast to the warmth and life she'd held in her hands just an hour before. She was a healer, a leader, the person they called when life hung by a thread. But in this moment, she was just another problem to be removed. How could it have come to this, in the very place she had dedicated her life to? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. 24 hours earlier, that same lobby had been a distant, irrelevant world. Camille's universe had been contained within the four walls of Operating Room 3, a theater of quiet intensity. For nearly a full day, she had stood over a young construction worker, a man with a wife and two small children, whose future was balanced on the microscopic tip of her instruments. The air in the OR was a living thing, thick with focus. It smelled of antiseptic and ozone. The only soundtrack was the rhythmic, reassuring beep of the cardiac monitor, the low, steady hum of the life support machinery, and the quiet, precise language of the surgical team as they moved in a practiced, silent ballet around the table. Camille's hands, gloved and steady, moved with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing to watch. They navigated the treacherous, delicate landscape of the human brain, a place where a millimeter's deviation meant the difference between a full life and a silent, empty one. Exhaustion was a dull ache etched deep into the lines around her eyes, a heavy weight on her shoulders, but it was a familiar companion. It was the price of admission for the work she did. Inside, she felt the immense pressure, the crushing weight of responsibility for the man on the table, for the family waiting in a sterile, beige room down the hall. But woven through the pressure was the familiar, powerful thread of adrenaline and the deep-seated purpose that had fueled her for over 2 decades. This wasn't just a job, it was a covenant she had made with every patient who was ever wheeled through those doors, a promise to stand between them and the void. After 20 grueling hours, the final suture was placed. The tension in the room broke like a fever. A collective quiet sigh of relief rippled through the team. The rhythmic beeping of the monitor, once a source of anxiety, was now a triumphant drumbeat. A junior resident, a young man with awe in his eyes, pulled his mask down. "That was incredible, Doctor. I've never seen anything like it. The way you navigated that arterial cluster, it was masterful." Camille offered a tired but genuine smile, the expression not quite reaching her weary eyes. "Team effort," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. "You all did beautifully. Now, get some rest, all of you. That's an order." As her team began to disperse, a profound wave of exhaustion washed over her, the kind that went bone deep, settling into her marrow. It was a physical and mental depletion so complete it felt like its own state of being, yet, coupled with it was the quiet, immense satisfaction of a life saved, a family kept whole. It was a feeling more potent than any drug, a profound sense of rightness in the universe that made the sacrifice, the sleepless nights, the missed dinners, all worth it. She moved on autopilot, stripping off her surgical gear in the locker room. The blood-spattered booties, the gown, the gloves, the mask, all of it was discarded, a snake shedding its skin. She pulled on a fresh set of plain, unadorned navy blue scrubs, the soft cotton a small comfort against her skin. From the back of her locker, she retrieved a simple, well-worn gray hoodie she kept for moments just like this. It was her comfort object, a shield against the world. Pulling it on, she looked less like the formidable head of a major surgical department and more like any other tired resident at the end of a brutal shift. The hospital corridors were quiet, almost empty at this late hour. The daytime bustle had been replaced by a sterile, impersonal hush, broken only by the distant squeak of a janitor's cart and the low hum of the building's nervous system. The hospital at night was a different world, a place of shadows and whispers, where the raw, messy business of life and death felt both more immediate and more distant. She walked towards the main lobby, her footsteps soft on the polished linoleum. Her husband was on his way, and the thought of sinking into the passenger seat of their car, of the quiet drive home, was a beacon of light. The main lobby was a vast, cathedral-like space designed to impress visitors and donors with its gleaming marble floors and expensive, uncomfortable-looking furniture. At this hour, it was deserted save for a lone figure behind the security desk. Camille found a padded chair in a quiet corner, away from the main entrance. She slumped into it, the exhaustion she'd been holding at bay finally claiming her. Her body felt like a lead weight. She pulled the hood of her sweatshirt up over her head, a small act of retreat, a way to create a tiny, private space in the cavernous lobby. She closed her eyes. The sounds of the lobby, the hum of the fluorescent lights, the distant whir of a floor polisher, all fading into a distant, muffled drone. She wasn't asleep, but hovering in that liminal space just before it, a state of near-total shutdown. From his perch behind the security desk, Mark watched her. Mark was a man in his late 50s who felt the world had passed him by. His uniform was a size too tight. His posture, a permanent slump of resentment. He wielded his minor authority with excessive zeal, a small king in a small, sterile kingdom. He saw the world through a lens of suspicion, a constant parade of potential threats and rule-breakers. When he looked across the lobby, he didn't see a doctor resting after saving a life. He saw a black woman in a hoodie, slumped in a chair, who didn't belong in the pristine lobby of the prestigious Northwood General Hospital. He watched her for a few minutes, his initial suspicion hardening into a concrete certainty. He muttered to himself, his voice a low grumble, complaining about the loiterers and the element that always tried to sneak in at night, looking for a warm place to sleep. "Not on my watch," he whispered to the bank of security monitors in front of him. "This isn't a shelter." He pushed himself up from his chair, his joints cracking in protest, and began his slow, deliberate walk across the marble floor. Each step felt heavy with self-importance. He stopped directly in front of Camille's chair, looming over her. "Ma'am," he said, his tone not a question but an order. "You can't sleep here. You need to move along." Camille was startled from her near sleep, her eyes fluttering open. The world came back into focus slowly, the bright lights of the lobby momentarily blinding. She looked up at the uniformed man, her mind still foggy with fatigue. "I'm sorry?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. "I'm not sleeping. I'm waiting for my ride. I work here." Mark let out a short, sharp sound, a scoff that was pure derision. "Right. Everyone works here. Lady, I've heard it all. I need you to leave the premises now." Camille blinked, trying to process the hostility. It was a simple misunderstanding, that's all. She was too tired to argue, too drained to feel anything but a dull confusion. She reached down to the waistband of her scrubs, where her ID card was clipped. "No, really," she said, trying to lift the card for him to see. "I'm Dr. Johnson, see?" He waved a dismissive hand, not even glancing at the ID. "I've seen 100 fake IDs. They sell them on the internet. I'm not stupid. Out, now." His voice had risen in volume, taking on a hard, uncompromising edge. Camille let her hand fall back to her lap. A flicker of annoyance cut through her exhaustion. She was a department head. She had performed miracles in this building. The sheer absurdity of the situation was beginning to dawn on her. She was too tired to stand, too tired to move, too tired to believe this was actually happening. She simply stared at him, her mind refusing to cooperate. Her failure to immediately comply was, in Mark's eyes, an act of defiance. He saw it as a direct challenge to his authority. His face hardened, his jaw tightening. He reached for the radio, clipped to his shoulder, his movements suddenly sharp and purposeful. "Dispatch. This is Security Desk 1, he said, his voice now booming with officialdom in the silent lobby. "I've got a non-compliant individual in the main lobby, refusing to leave, requesting police assistance." The radio crackled and then fell silent, but the words hung in the air, thick and menacing. The security guard, Mark, stood with his chest puffed out, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He had followed protocol. He had asserted his dominance. Now, the real authority was on its way. Camille watched him, a strange sense of detachment settling over her. The exhaustion was a thick fog, and this bizarre confrontation felt like a dream, a surreal play unfolding in the cold, impersonal theater of the hospital lobby. She felt less like a participant and more like a spectator watching a scene she couldn't quite believe was real. The squeak of heavy boots on the polished marble floor announced their arrival before the automatic doors had fully swished open. 2 police officers strode into the lobby, their presence immediately sucking the remaining air out of the vast space. The atmosphere, already tense, now felt charged with an official, intimidating energy. The older of the two, a man with a weary, cynical set to his jaw and the name Davis's on his tag, scanned the lobby with an air of profound boredom, as if this was the 1,000th pointless call he'd answered this month. His younger partner, Officer Rodriguez, had a more open, impressionable face, his eyes wide as he took in the grand, silent lobby. Mark, the security guard, practically vibrated with importance. He straightened his already stiff posture and pointed a thick finger at Camille, who remained seated in the corner. "That's her," he announced, his voice a little too loud. "Over there. I told her to leave, multiple times. She refused. Became belligerent." The word belligerent struck Camille with a fresh wave of absurdity. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't moved, hadn't done anything but try to explain. The lie was so blatant, so unnecessary, it was almost impressive. Officer Davis ambled over, his partner a step behind him. He stopped a few feet from her chair, his hand resting casually on his belt, near his sidearm. His gaze swept over her, taking in the scrubs, the hoodie, the exhaustion on her face, and his expression hardened with a preformed conclusion. "Evening, ma'am," he said, his tone heavy with a weariness that presupposed her guilt. "We got a call that you're trespassing. What's the story?" Camille kept her hands resting in her lap, forcing herself to project a calm she was far from feeling. Her surgeon's mind kicked in, an instinct honed over thousands of hours of crisis management. Asterisk, assess the situation, de-escalate, provide clear, concise information. Asterisk, there's been a misunderstanding, she began, her voice even and steady, a stark contrast to the guard's agitated pronouncements. "My name is Dr. Camille Johnson. I'm the head of surgery here at this hospital. I just finished a 20-hour shift, and I am waiting for my husband to pick me up." She was running a diagnostic in her head, just as she would in the OR. Asterisk, patient is presenting with acute prejudice, complicated by a superiority complex. Prognosis, poor. Asterisk, but the variables were all wrong. This wasn't a medical emergency. It was a social one, a malignancy of perception, and her years of training, her encyclopedic knowledge of the human body, felt utterly useless. She couldn't excise a bad idea with a scalpel. She tried again, reaching for the one piece of concrete evidence she possessed. She unclipped her ID from her waistband and held it out. "You can see for yourself, my identification." The plastic card lay flat on her palm. Her photo, taken on a busy Tuesday 5 years ago, smiled out, her hair neater, her eyes less tired. Her name, Camille Johnson, MD, was printed in bold black letters, and below it the title that had been the culmination of her life's work, Head, Department of Surgery. Officer Davis took the ID. He held it between his thumb and forefinger, glanced at it for less than a second, and then, with a small, dismissive smirk, handed it back to her. The gesture was more insulting than any word he could have spoken. It was an erasure. "Nice try," he said, the smirk widening into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "These are a dime a dozen. You can get anything printed online these days." He turned his head slightly to his partner, Rodriguez, as if giving a lesson to a rookie. "See, this is what they do. They get aggressive, they lie, they always have a story." That was the moment. It wasn't a sound, but a feeling, the sickening lurch of the floor dropping out from under her. In that single contemptuous glance, her identity, her years of sacrifice, the brutal residency, the endless exams, the lives held in her hands, all of it had been invalidated, reduced to a cheap forgery. A cold, hard fury began to smolder in the pit of her stomach, a clean, sharp anger that burned through the fog of her exhaustion. It was followed by a wave of humiliation so profound it felt like a physical sting, sharp and deep and utterly debasing. She was no longer Dr. Johnson. She was one of they. Still, she made one final attempt to reason with them, to appeal to the logic she had to believe still existed somewhere within their uniforms. Her voice was tighter now, the professional calm fraying at the edges. "My office is on the 4th floor, she said, speaking directly to Rodriguez, hoping his younger eyes might hold a flicker of reason. "The entire surgical wing is named after my mentor, Dr. Albright. You can call the hospital administrator, Dr. Finch. His personal number is on the emergency staff directory, which security has behind their desk. You can verify my identity in countless ways. It would take you 2 minutes." Officer Davis stepped forward, cutting off any potential response from his partner. He loomed over her, his shadow falling across her lap. "I'm not playing games or running errands for you, ma'am," he said, his voice dropping into a low, menacing register. I gave you a lawful order to leave. The security guard gave you a lawful order to leave. You've refused. That's trespassing." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Stand up. You're being detained." The command was so utterly disconnected from reality that Camille was momentarily stunned into inaction. Her mind simply couldn't bridge the gap between who she was and what was happening. She was the head of surgery, sitting in her own hospital, and she was being told she was under arrest for trespassing. The sheer, unadulterated absurdity of it all was paralyzing. Davis took her stillness as defiance. His face, already a mask of cynical impatience, twisted into a snarl of anger. "I said, stand up!" he barked, and before she could react, he grabbed her arm. The grip was rough, shockingly so. His fingers dug into her bicep, a brute force she hadn't felt since she was a child who'd fallen from a tree. The shock of it was electric, a violation that went deeper than the skin. These hands, her hands, were her livelihood. They were instruments of healing, of precision, of life itself. They were insured for millions of dollars. But more than that, they were a sacred trust. And this man was handling her like a sack of garbage. A surgeon's instinct, primal and deeply ingrained, took over. It wasn't a conscious thought, but a reflex to protect her hands at all costs. She stood up slowly, not out of compliance with his order, but to release the pressure on her arm, to shield her most precious tools from his careless, brutish strength. The moment she was on her feet, he twisted her arm behind her back with practiced, painful efficiency. Her other arm was wrenched back to meet it. She felt the cold, unforgiving metal against her skin before she heard the sound. Asterisk. Click. Asterisk. The sound of the handcuffs locking into place was unnaturally loud, echoing in the cavernous, silent lobby. It was a sound of finality, a punctuation mark on the end of her identity. The cuffs were tight, biting into the delicate skin of her wrists, the very place where she would take a pulse, where she felt for the thrum of life. A burning shame washed over her, hot and suffocating. Across the lobby, a janitor had stopped his mopping, his mouth slightly agape. A young couple, likely visiting a patient in the ER, stood frozen near the elevators, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. She was a spectacle, a problem being dealt with, a criminal. Her mind, a place of complex surgical plans and anatomical charts, flashed to an image from years ago. A young man had been brought into the ER, his wrists raw and bruised from a pair of handcuffs after a fight. She had noted the injuries in his chart with a detached, clinical professionalism, treating the abrasions with antiseptic and a calm efficiency before moving on to his more serious wounds. She had felt a flicker of sympathy, but it was distant, abstract. Now, in the cold grip of the steel, she felt a sliver of his experience, the utter, soul-crushing powerlessness, the public branding that screamed times you are wrong, you are less asterisk. The irony was a bitter pill, a toxic medicine she was being forced to swallow. She, Dr. Camille Johnson, who had dedicated her life to mending the broken, was now broken herself, not by a fall or a disease, but by a glance, a judgment, a click of cold steel in the lobby of her own hospital. The place she had considered a second home had, in an instant, become a prison. And as she stood there, stripped of her dignity, her mind could only form a single, looping question, a question that had no answer. How could this be happening? The quiet hum of the lobby was suddenly pierced by a new sound, the smooth, almost silent swish of the automatic doors opening once more. A man walked in, his distinguished silver hair and the impeccable cut of his tweed jacket marking him as someone of importance. He was Dr. Alistair Finch, the hospital's esteemed chief of surgery, a man whose calm demeanor was as legendary as his surgical skill. In his hands, he balanced two large paper cups of coffee, steam ghosting from the small holes in their lids. He'd received a text from Camille's husband, David, who was hopelessly stuck in a traffic snarl on the interstate and had asked, with a hint of worry, if Alistair wouldn't mind checking on her, maybe bring her a coffee to keep her going until he could get there. Finch scanned the lobby, a slight frown creasing his brow as he took in the scene. Two police officers, a security guard who looked both agitated and smug, and a woman in scrubs and a hoodie, her back to him, her wrists bound behind her. His frown deepened into one of annoyance. A police matter in the main lobby was unseemly, a disruption to the sanctuary of healing he so fiercely protected. He began to walk toward the group, his shoes making soft, authoritative taps on the marble. "What's all this commotion?" he asked, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man used to being listened to. "This is a hospital, not a police station. We have patients trying to rest." Officer Davis, without turning to properly look at the man who had just spoken, gave a dismissive wave of his hand. "Just clearing out a trespasser, sir," he said, his tone suggesting the interruption was an inconvenience. "She refused to leave, so we're taking her in. It'll be over in a minute." Finch moved closer, his path taking him around the officers to get a better look at the source of the disturbance. The officers, sensing his approach, shifted slightly, turning Camille just enough that her face came into his view. The world seemed to stop. The 2 coffee cups, one for him, one for the brilliant surgeon he mentored and now answered to, slipped from his grasp. They hit the pristine white floor with a soft, wet thud, and dark, steaming liquid exploded outwards, a chaotic brown stain instantly marring the sterile perfection of the lobby. The room, which had been filled with a tense silence, now fell into a new kind of quiet, a deafening, absolute stillness, broken only by the slow, rhythmic drip, drip, drip of coffee from the edge of a nearby table onto the spreading puddle. Finch's face, usually a placid mask of professional calm, became a terrifying, rapidly shifting canvas of emotion. First, there was simple confusion, his brain refusing to process the image before him. Then came a wave of stark, chilling disbelief. And finally, as the reality of the scene cemented itself, a deep, thunderous rage began to build behind his eyes, a storm gathering in the depths of his soul. His voice, when he finally found it, was a low, guttural whisper, each word trembling with a fury so profound it seemed to vibrate in the air itself. "What have you done?" The raw, menacing power in those 4 simple words startled Officer Davis. He finally turned his full attention to the well-dressed man, taking in the expensive jacket and the look of pure murder on his face. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his features for the first time. "Sir," he began, his own voice losing some of its cocksure swagger, "do you know this woman?" Finch ignored him completely. His eyes, blazing with a righteous fire, locked onto the younger officer, Rodriguez, whose own eyes were wide with a dawning, sickening horror as he looked from the furious man to the woman in handcuffs and back again. Finch's voice was low, a predator's growl. "Officer," he said, his gaze pinning the young man in place, "do you have any idea who this is?" Without waiting for an answer, he spun back to face Davis, his voice no longer a whisper, but a rising tide of controlled volcanic anger that echoed in the cavernous space. "This trespasser?" He spat the word like a poison. "This is Dr. Camille Johnson. She is the head of the Department of Surgery for this entire hospital. She performed a 20-hour brain surgery that ended less than 2 hours ago. She is, to put it in terms you might possibly be able to comprehend." He leaned in, his voice dropping again but losing none of its intensity. "My boss." The final 2 words landed like hammer blows. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The blood drained from Officer Davis's face, leaving behind a pasty gray pallor. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish gasping for air. The arrogant smirk that had been plastered on his face moments before had vanished, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. He looked as though he had just been told the building was on fire, and he was chained to the floor. The security guard, Mark, who had been standing by with a look of smug vindication, now seemed to shrink into himself. His face went from flushed with pride to ashen with terror. He looked desperately from Finch to Camille and then to the floor, as if fervently wishing it would open up and swallow him whole, sparing him from the cataclysm he had unleashed. Officer Rodriguez, however, was the first to move. A look of profound shame and horror washed over his young face. He fumbled at his belt for the handcuff key, his hands shaking so badly that he dropped it. The tiny piece of metal clattered on the marble floor with a sound that was deafening in the silent room. He snatched it up, his movements clumsy and frantic, and rushed to Camille's side. "Doctor, I'm so sorry," he stammered, his fingers fumbling with the lock. We didn't." The handcuffs clicked open. Camille slowly brought her hands forward, her movements stiff and deliberate. She didn't look at anyone. Her gaze was fixed on her own wrists as she rubbed them, a gesture that was both instinctive and deeply sorrowful. On the dark bronze of her skin, angry red marks were already forming, stark and accusatory, a physical record of the indignity she had just endured. Finch's rage, far from being placated, now had a new target. He turned the full force of his fury back onto the paralyzed Officer Davis. "You put her in handcuffs?" he roared, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. You put handcuffs on the hands that saved 3 lives this week alone, including the son of a city councilman? The hands that this entire city trusts to perform miracles. You put her career, this hospital's reputation, and the very concept of justice at risk because you were too lazy, too arrogant, too blinded by your own prejudice to do your job. Each question was a blow, and Davis flinched, as if he'd been physically struck, He had no answer. There was no answer. Through it all, Camille felt a strange and unsettling detachment. The anger was there, a cold, hard knot of it deep in her stomach, a righteous fury that burned with a clean, white-hot flame, but it was overlaid with a profound and weary sense of sorrow. She looked at the faces around her, the panicked officers, the terrified guard, the apoplectic doctor. Finch! And she felt a wave of sadness so immense it threatened to drown her. This wasn't just about her. It wasn't a personal attack. Not really. It was about the uniform she wore, the simple, anonymous scrubs, and the skin she wore, the skin that had been her home for her entire life. It was about how those two things, in the eyes of these men, had been misinterpreted so catastrophically, so completely, that they had erased everything else she was. They hadn't seen a doctor, a leader, a healer. They had seen a threat, a problem, a stereotype. Her humiliation was a symptom of a much larger disease, and the thought brought her no comfort, only a deep, aching grief for a world so broken. The sound of running footsteps broke the spell. A woman in a sharp business suit, her face a mask of pure panic, came skidding around the corner, her phone pressed to her ear. It was Miss Albright, the hospital's night administrator, alerted by a frantic call from the janitor who had witnessed the entire, horrifying spectacle. "What is going on?" she cried, her eyes wide as she took in the scene, the spilled coffee, the police, and the furious chief of surgery standing over them. Her gaze fell on Camille, on the red marks blooming on her wrists, and her face went from panic to utterly horrified. The institutional machine, slow and ponderous, had finally been alerted. The scene was now perfectly set, not for a resolution, but for the frantic, desperate process of damage control to begin. The conference room on the executive floor was a sterile, impersonal box, designed for uncomfortable conversations. The air, thick with the smell of stale coffee and palpable tension, felt recycled and thin. An hour had passed since the chaos in the lobby, an hour that felt like a lifetime. Camille sat at one end of a long, polished mahogany table, her hands wrapped around a ceramic mug of chamomile tea that Dr. Finch had insisted on getting for her. The warmth was a small, grounding comfort in the cold, surreal landscape of her new reality. Across from her sat Miss Albright, the night administrator, her face still pale with panic, her hands wringing each other relentlessly in her lap. Next to her was Arthur Vance, the hospital's lead legal counsel, a man whose sharp suit and sharper eyes seemed to cut through the emotional fog in the room, reducing everything to a matter of liability and mitigation. He had a stack of papers spread out before him, a neat, orderly fortress of legal jargon in a world that had just proven to be anything but. Dr. Finch sat beside Camille, not speaking, but his presence was a solid, unwavering wall of support. Arthur cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He steepled his fingers, his gaze fixed on Camille, but his words were addressed to the problem she represented. "This is, to put it mildly, an unmitigated disaster," he began, his voice crisp and devoid of emotion. "The potential exposure for the city, and by extension the reputational damage to this hospital through association, is astronomical. However," he paused, leaning forward slightly, "from a purely legal standpoint, it is also an open and shut case. We have video evidence from multiple angles. We have the security guard's own recorded call, which is demonstrably false. We have multiple witnesses. We have unlawful detainment, assault, defamation of character, and gross negligence on the part of the officers in the security firm." He picked up a pen and tapped it on his notepad. "The city's attorneys will want this to go away quietly and quickly. They cannot afford a public trial where a jury sees the head of surgery at Northwood General being treated like a common criminal. We're looking at a settlement, Doctor, a significant one. I would estimate we start negotiations at $2 million, but I am confident we can secure at least $1.5 million, likely more. That would be in addition to a full, public apology from the mayor's office and the police department, and the immediate termination of the officers involved." Camille was quiet, her gaze lost in the swirling steam rising from her tea. She barely seemed to be listening. The numbers, the talk of lawsuits and settlements, felt like a conversation happening in another room, about another person. Her mind wasn't on the money. It was replaying the events in the lobby, not with the hot flush of shame she had felt then, but with the cold, detached analysis of a surgeon examining a wound. She saw the rough grip of the officer's hand on her arm, the cold click of the cuffs, the dismissive smirk on his face. But then, the image began to blur, and other faces swam into her focus. She thought of Mrs. Garcia, an elderly Hispanic woman who had come into the ER a few months ago, complaining of chest pains, only to be told it was probably just anxiety, until her EKG came back showing a massive heart attack in progress. She thought of Jamal, a young black man with sickle cell anemia, who had been accused of being a drug seeker by a triage nurse when he came in, writhing in agony from a pain crisis. She thought of the countless patients she had seen from marginalized communities, the ones who arrived at the hospital already braced for a fight, their eyes filled with a weary distrust, expecting to be dismissed, disbelieved, or disrespected. She had always seen it, had always known it was there, a chronic, low-grade infection in the system. She had fought it in her own way, with mentorship programs, with policy changes within her department, with the simple act of treating every single person who came through her doors with the same unwavering dignity. But she had never truly understood it. Not until now. The humiliation she had felt, the erasure of her identity, the sting of being judged and condemned based on nothing more than her appearance, it wasn't an anomaly. It was a window. It was a brief, terrifying glimpse into the everyday reality for so many of her patients. What had been an isolated, shocking incident for her was a constant, grinding reality for them. The disease of prejudice didn't just cause hurt feelings, it was a direct threat to public health. It made people hesitate to seek medical care. It made them doubt the very people who were supposed to help them. It created a chasm of distrust that no scalpel could ever hope to bridge. We can have the officers suspended pending a full investigation, which will, of course, lead to their dismissal. Miss Albright chimed in, her voice high and reedy. She was desperate to offer something, anything, to fix this. The security guard has already been fired, naturally. His firm's contract is under immediate review. We will do whatever you want, Dr. Johnson. We will support you in any action you choose to take, whatever it takes to make this right. Camille finally looked up. The fog of exhaustion and sorrow in her eyes had cleared, replaced by a calm, steady light. Her gaze moved from Miss Albright's panicked face to Arthur's clinical stare, and finally to Dr. Finch, who simply watched her, his expression one of quiet expectation. "I don't want to sue," she said. The three words dropped into the silent room like stones into a still pond. The ripples of their impact were immediate. Miss Albright looked as if Camille had just started speaking in a foreign language. Arthur's carefully constructed professional mask slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing a flicker of genuine astonishment. He blinked, his mind clearly struggling to recategorize the situation. A lawsuit was the only logical conclusion. It was the established, accepted path. This was a deviation from the script he knew by heart. "Doctor," Arthur said slowly, recovering his composure. He leaned forward again, his tone shifting from that of a lawyer to that of a patient, condescending guide. "With all due respect, I don't think you fully understand the leverage you have here. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to hold the city accountable and to be compensated for what was a truly egregious violation of your rights." A small, humorless smile touched Camille's lips. "Oh, I understand the leverage I have perfectly, Arthur," she replied, her voice soft but laced with a steel he hadn't heard before. "And I fully intend to use it. All of it." She placed her mug down on the table with a soft click. "A lawsuit gives me money. It makes this entire incident about me, about my personal injury, my personal humiliation. But this isn't just about me. Can't you see that?" She looked at them, her gaze sweeping across their confused faces. "Firing one guard or suspending two officers is like putting a bandage on a tumor. It might look better for a little while. It might make us feel like we've done something. But the disease, the cancer underneath, is still there, growing and spreading. You're talking about treating a symptom. I'm interested in curing the disease itself. I don't want a settlement." Her eyes locked on Miss Albright. "I want a press conference." The panic in Miss Albright's eyes intensified, blooming into full-blown terror. "A press conference?" she squeaked, her voice cracking. "Dr. Johnson, no. The PR fallout could be catastrophic. It's much better to handle these things internally, quietly. We can control the narrative." Camille let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound of pure, bitter irony. "The PR fallout already happened, Miss Albright," she said, her voice rising with a passion that made the administrator flinch. "It happened in our lobby. It happened when my wrists were scraped raw by handcuffs. It happens every single day in hospitals all over this country when a person is judged by their appearance instead of their symptoms, when their pain is dismissed because of the color of their skin. You want to make this right? You want to control the narrative? Then give me a podium. Give me a microphone." She stood up, her chair scraping back against the floor. She was no longer the victim in this story. She was its author. She was leveraging the one thing the institution truly feared, not a lawsuit, but public shame, and she was turning it into a tool, not for personal gain, but to force a conversation they had been avoiding for decades. No lawyers, she continued, her voice ringing with an authority that dwarfed everyone else's in the room. No pre-written, vetted statements designed to minimize liability. Let me talk. Let me use this horrifying, humiliating moment to talk about what really matters: dignity, trust, and the lives that are lost when we allow them to be eroded. Arthur and Albright were speechless, staring at her as if she had grown a second head. This was not damage control. This was throwing a match into a room full of gasoline. Dr. Finch, who had been silent throughout the entire exchange, slowly pushed his own chair back and stood up beside her. He placed a supportive, steadying hand on her shoulder. His voice, when he spoke, was calm but carried the unmistakable weight of a final decision. "She's right, Arthur," he said, his gaze fixed on the stunned lawyer. "This is bigger than a lawsuit. This is about the integrity of our institution, about the covenant we have with our community. We stand behind our head of surgery. We stand behind Dr. Johnson." He turned his gaze to the trembling Miss Albright. "Arrange the press conference." The day after the decision was made, Camille stood in her office on the 4th floor. It was a corner office, a testament to her station, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. From this height, the world transformed. The snarling traffic on the streets below became silent rivers of light, and the sprawling metropolis looked less like a chaotic assembly of concrete and steel, and more like a single, complex organism, its millions of inhabitants, the individual cells that gave it life. She saw it as she saw her patients, a living entity, full of intricate systems, vulnerable to disease, and capable of healing. Her office was a reflection of her journey. One wall was lined with mahogany bookshelves, groaning under the weight of medical texts, their spines cracked from years of use. Another wall was adorned with the framed accolades of her career, diplomas from prestigious universities, awards for surgical innovation, and plaques of recognition from a grateful city. They weren't trophies to her, but markers of a path, reminders of a promise she had made to herself and to the world. On her desk, nestled between a state-of-the-art monitor and a neat stack of patient files, were a few personal photographs, one of her and David on their wedding day, another of her parents, their faces beaming with pride. It was a space that spoke of immense success, yet it felt less like a seat of power and more like a sanctuary, a quiet place to think, high above the fray. Today, however, the city below felt different. She felt the immense weight of the community she served, not just as a surgeon, but as something more, something she was only just beginning to understand. A soft knock on her door pulled her from her thoughts. A young woman with an eager, earnest face and a tablet clutched to her chest stepped inside. "Dr. Johnson, I'm Jessica from the Public Relations Department. Miss Albright sent me." Camille turned from the window and offered a small, tired smile. "Jessica, please, come in." The young PR representative approached her desk, her movements hesitant, as if she were entering a lion's den. She held out the tablet like an offering. "Dr. Johnson, we've taken the liberty of drafting a statement for you for the press conference tomorrow," she said, her voice a carefully modulated blend of professionalism and sympathy. "It hits all the key points. We've made sure to mention the hospital's unwavering commitment to diversity and inclusion. We've outlined our plan to implement a series of procedural reviews and to roll out enhanced sensitivity training modules for all staff, including third-party contractors." She swiped a finger across the screen. "It's professional, it's been thoroughly vetted by the legal team, and it shows that we are taking immediate, proactive steps to address the situation." Camille took the tablet. Her eyes scanned the first paragraph, a dense block of text filled with corporate jargon and carefully chosen, meaningless platitudes. Words like synergy, stakeholders, robust dialogue, and moving forward littered the page. The statement was a masterpiece of deflection, a carefully constructed shield designed to absorb the blow of public outrage while admitting no real fault. It was written to protect the hospital's brand, to insulate the institution from liability. It had nothing to do with the truth. She read the first few sentences, her expression unreadable, and then, with a soft but firm click, she locked the screen and handed the tablet back to Jessica. "Jessica," she said, her voice gentle but carrying an unmistakable note of finality, "this statement is written to protect the hospital. I'm going to give a speech to help our patients. Thank you for your work, but I'll be writing my own." Jessica was visibly flustered. Her carefully prepared script had just been thrown out the window. "But doctor," she stammered, "legal has to approve anything that's said. For your protection, and for the hospital's." Camille held up a hand, silencing her. My protection is not what's important right now. The hospital will be protected when it proves it's worthy of the community's trust. That's what I intend to talk about." She looked directly into the young woman's eyes, and Jessica saw a resolve so absolute, so unshakable, that it left no room for argument. This was not a negotiation. This was a directive. Jessica swallowed hard, nodded silently, and backed out of the office, closing the door softly behind her. Alone again, Camille walked over to her desk and sat down. She pushed aside the patient files and the monitor and pulled a blank yellow legal pad into the empty space before her. She picked up a heavy black fountain pen, a gift from her father when she graduated from medical school. For a long time she just sat there, staring at the empty lined page. She didn't start writing. She closed her eyes. Her mind, a place usually filled with surgical pathways and anatomical charts, drifted back in time. She thought about her first day of medical school, the overwhelming sense of awe and terror as she stood with her class to recite the Hippocratic Oath, the ancient promise to, first, do no harm. She had felt the weight of those words then, but she felt them with a new, crushing gravity now. Harm wasn't always inflicted with a scalpel. It could be inflicted with a glance, a word, a judgment. It could be inflicted by a system that saw a threat where there was only weariness. She thought about the thousands of faces she had seen over the years, the faces of patients, etched with fear, hope, and pain. She thought of the triumphs, the impossible surgeries that had succeeded against all odds, the quiet, profound joy of telling a family that their loved one was going to be okay. She thought of the failures, the lives she couldn't save, the faces that still haunted her in the quiet hours of the night. Each one had been a lesson. Each one had been a sacred trust. Her thoughts turned to the security guard, Mark. In the heat of the moment, she had felt only anger and indignation toward him. But now, in the quiet of her office, she tried to see him not as a villain, but as a man. What had happened in his life? What disappointments had he suffered? What fears had been stoked in him that led him to see a monster in the shadows where there was only a tired woman in a hoodie? She thought of Officer Davis, of his casual cruelty, the bored, cynical superiority that seemed to be his default setting. His prejudice wasn't a passionate, burning hatred. It was something far more insidious, a dull, systemic rot, a lazy reliance on stereotypes that saved him the trouble of seeing the person standing in front of him. Her anger was still there, a cold, hard stone in her gut, but it was no longer the primary emotion. It was being replaced by a deep, aching sadness, and beneath that, a flicker of something else, a steely resolve. She decided then that her speech would not be about anger. Anger was a fire that consumed everything. She needed to build, not burn. Her speech would be about connection. It would be a prescription. A knock, firmer this time, came from the door. Dr. Finch entered before she answered, holding 2 steaming mugs. He navigated the space with a familiar ease, placing one of the mugs on her desk. The rich, dark aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. "The board of directors is in an absolute uproar," he said, settling into the leather chair opposite her desk. "They think you're trying to single-handedly destroy the hospital's reputation. The mayor's office has been trying to backchannel all morning, offering everything under the sun to make this go away quietly." He took a sip from his mug, his eyes studying her over the rim. "How are you holding up?" A faint smile touched Camille's lips. "I've faced down tougher crowds in the operating room," she said, her voice quiet but steady. She wrapped her hands around the warm mug. "They're afraid of the wrong thing, Alistair. They're afraid of looking bad. They're afraid of a dip in the polls or a drop in donor contributions." She looked past him, out the window at the sprawling city. "They should be afraid of people dying in their homes because they're too scared to come to a hospital. They should be afraid of a mother hesitating to bring in her child with a fever because she thinks she'll be treated like a criminal instead of a patient. That's what they should be afraid of." Finch nodded slowly, a look of profound respect in his eyes. "What you're doing, Camille," he said, his voice low and sincere. "It's braver than anything I've ever seen you do with a scalpel, and I've seen you perform miracles." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "I want you to know, the entire surgical staff is behind you. We've been talking all morning. We're proud you're our chief. We're with you, 100%. The words were a balm on a wound she hadn't even realized was still so raw. In the whirlwind of the last 36 hours, she had felt profoundly alone, an island in a storm of institutional panic. But Finch's words, the simple, unwavering declaration of solidarity, changed everything. It was a reminder that she was not just fighting for herself, or even for her patients, but for the very soul of her profession. The support was a shield, a reinforcement that strengthened her resolve into something unbreakable, She knew she was not alone. The morning of the press conference arrived with a pale, grey light that filtered through her bedroom window. Camille stood before her closet, the rows of expensive suits and elegant dresses seeming like costumes for a different person, a different life. For a moment, she considered putting on a power suit, the traditional armor of a woman in a man's world, but she pushed the thought aside. This wasn't about power in that sense. It wasn't about projecting an image of corporate strength. It was about reclaiming her true identity. She chose a simple, dark blue sheath dress and, over it, she put on her clean, crisp white doctor's coat. It was the uniform of her profession, the symbol of her office, the very thing they had failed to see under the grey hoodie. The coat was her armor, but it was also her flag, a declaration of who and what she was. As she buttoned it, she felt a sense of calm settle over her. This felt right. This felt true. She stood before the full-length mirror in her bedroom, looking at her own reflection. The past 2 days had taken their toll. There were tired lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, a new tension in the set of her jaw. The incident had stripped something away from her, a layer of professional detachment, a comfortable naivete that had allowed her to believe her title and her accomplishments made her immune to the ugliness of the world. That illusion was gone forever. But as she looked closer, she saw that the ordeal had not just taken something, it had revealed something. Underneath the exhaustion, in the depths of her eyes, there was a fire that hadn't been there before, a fierce, focused intensity. The humiliation had been a crucible, burning away the non-essential, leaving behind a core of purpose that was harder and purer than before. She was still Dr. Camille Johnson. She was still a healer. But now, she understood that some wounds were not visible on an MRI, and some healing had to happen outside the walls of an operating room. She took a deep breath, adjusted the collar of her white coat, and walked out to face the world. The hospital auditorium, usually reserved for medical symposiums and donor galas, was transformed into a media battleground. The air was hot and thick, smelling of electricity and nervous sweat. A forest of microphones bristled on the podium, and the relentless staccato flash of cameras created a disorienting strobe effect, catching the anxious faces of the hospital staff who lined the back and side walls. In the front row, Miss Albright sat ramrod straight, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap her knuckles were white. Beside her, Dr. Finch watched the podium with a quiet, unwavering intensity, his face a mask of grim support. The room was a cacophony, a buzzing hive of anticipation, as reporters shouted questions at the empty stage, each one trying to dominate the narrative before it had even begun. Then, a side door opened, and a hush fell over the room, spreading like a wave from the front row to the back. Dr. Camille Johnson walked onto the stage. She didn't hurry. Her steps were measured and deliberate. She wore no power suit, no statement jewelry, only a simple dress and her crisp, white doctor's coat. In the chaotic glare of the media lights, the coat seemed to glow, a beacon of clean, calm professionalism in a room churning with speculation and cynicism. She walked to the podium, the sea of reporters parting silently before her. She placed her hands on either side of it, her fingers resting lightly on the wood. Her hands, the hands that had been bound in steel 2 nights ago, were perfectly steady. She adjusted the microphone, the small movement amplified in the profound silence, and looked out at the crowd, her gaze sweeping over the cameras, the reporters, and finally, the faces of her colleagues standing in the back. She began to speak, her voice clear and strong, filling the auditorium not with the thunder of anger, but with the resonant clarity of truth. 2 nights ago, she started, her tone factual and devoid of self-pity. In the main lobby of this hospital, I was arrested for trespassing while waiting for my husband to pick me up. I was wearing scrubs and a hoodie. I had just finished a 20-hour surgery, during which my team and I saved a man's life. I was exhausted, but I was also proud of the work we had done. An hour later, I was in handcuffs. A murmur went through the crowd, the reporters scribbling furiously in their notebooks. Camille let the starkness of the statement settle before she continued. "I am not here today to talk about myself," she said, her voice gaining a new layer of intensity. "I am not here to seek apologies or compensation, or to assign blame to any single individual. I am here to talk about the single most important instrument in this hospital. It is not a scalpel, or an MRI machine, or a ventilator. It is trust." She paused, letting the word hang in the air. That trust is fragile. It is the invisible thread that connects a patient to a healer. It is the belief that when you are at your most vulnerable, you will be met not with suspicion, but with compassion, not with judgment, but with care. And that trust is eroded. It is chipped away. Every time a patient is judged on the color of their skin, the clothes they wear, or the accent in their voice, it is eroded when we allow our unconscious biases to become a pre-existing condition, a sickness that infects our judgment before we have even made a diagnosis. Her eyes found the camera lenses, speaking now not just to the room, but to the city beyond it. What happened to me was not just an error. It was not just a misunderstanding. It was a symptom of a sickness, and the cure for that sickness is not lawsuits or firings, though accountability is necessary. The cure is empathy. The cure is a conscious, deliberate choice to see the humanity in one another before we see anything else. Her voice rose with a quiet, powerful passion. I am asking our city, our community, and my own beloved staff at this hospital to see this incident not as a moment of shame, but as a moment of diagnosis. We have identified a problem. We have seen the pathology in plain sight. Now, we must treat it. We must commit to the difficult, ongoing work of healing ourselves. When you see someone in scrubs, you should see a helper, not a threat. When you see a person of color, you should see a person, not a stereotype. The next time you are quick to judge, the next time you feel that reflexive pull of suspicion towards someone who looks different from you, I want you to pause. I want you to take a breath, and I want you to choose dignity. Choose it for the person standing in front of you, and in doing so, choose it for yourself. She took a small breath, her gaze sweeping the room one last time. My name is Dr. Camille Johnson. I am the head of surgery at this hospital, and I am, and always will be, a member of this community, dedicated to healing it in any way I can. Thank you. She stepped back from the podium. For a long, breathless moment, there was absolute silence. The reporters, for the first time, were not shouting. The cameras were not flashing. The entire room seemed to be holding its collective breath, processing the weight of what had just been said. Then, from the back of the auditorium, a single person began to clap. It was a janitor, the same man who had witnessed her arrest. Then a nurse beside him joined in, then another and another. The applause grew, a wave of sound that started with the hospital staff, the people who worked in the trenches of care and understood the truth of her words in their bones. It spread through the room, swelling until it became a thunderous ovation, a wave of respect and admiration that washed over the stage. Some of the reporters, caught up in the moment, lowered their cameras and joined in. Camille did not smile. She did not weep. She simply stood there for a moment, her head held high, and gave a single, small, gracious nod. It was not an acceptance of praise. It was an acknowledgement. Her message had been delivered. Her prescription had been written. In a greasy spoon diner across town, Officer Davis watched the press conference on a small television mounted in the corner. He sat hunched over a cup of coffee, the sounds of the diner, the clatter of plates and the sizzle of the grill, fading into a dull roar. He saw her on the screen, not as the defiant woman in the hoodie, but as a figure of immense authority and grace. He heard her words, not as an accusation, but as a diagnosis, and for the first time he felt the cold, sickening shame of his own actions. He saw his own reflection in the darkened screen, the cynical smirk, the lazy cruelty, and he understood. He had been the disease she was talking about. He slowly put a few dollars on the counter and walked out, leaving his coffee untouched, the shame a heavier weight than the gun on his hip. Miles away, in the dim light of his living room, Mark, the former security guard, watched the same broadcast on his old television set. He had been fired, his career over, and he had spent the last day and a half stewing in a bitter broth of self-pity and resentment, blaming her, blaming the hospital, blaming the world for his misfortune. But as he listened to her speak, as he heard her talk not of anger or revenge, but of trust and dignity, the walls of his self-pity began to crumble. He saw the scene in the lobby not through the lens of his wounded pride, but through her eyes. He saw a tired woman, a healer, and he saw what he had done to her. He finally, truly, understood the magnitude of his mistake, and he buried his face in his hands, the silent, racking sobs of a man confronting the ugliest part of himself. Camille didn't wait for the post-conference chatter. She didn't stay to answer the questions that were now being shouted with a newfound respect. As the applause continued to roll through the auditorium, she turned and walked off the stage, disappearing through the same side door she had entered. She walked past a stunned Miss Albright and a proud, smiling Dr. Finch, giving his hand a grateful squeeze as she passed. She didn't head for the exit. She took the elevator, the one reserved for staff, and rode it back up to the surgical wing. As the doors slid open, the chaotic noise of the press conference faded away, replaced by the steady, rhythmic, and deeply comforting sounds of the hospital's heart. The gentle beep of a distant monitor, The quiet squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum, the low murmur of nurses conferring at their station. This was her world. This was her sanctuary. She walked down the familiar corridor, the scent of antiseptic, a welcome perfume. She stopped at the large surgical scheduling board, a mosaic of names, times, and procedures. She picked up a dry erase marker, her fingers closing around it with a familiar sense of purpose. A junior resident, a young woman whose face she recognized from her team the other day, approached her, her eyes shining with an admiration that bordered on reverence. "That was amazing, doctor," the resident said, her voice barely a whisper. "What you said, it was everything we all feel but never know how to say. It was amazing." Camille looked from the board to the young resident's earnest face. A small, genuine smile, the first one in 2 days, touched her lips. It was a smile of gratitude, but also of focus, of moving forward. The battle downstairs was over. The work up here was endless. "Thank you," she said, her voice warm and steady. "Now, let's talk about the craniotomy scheduled for 7 a.m. tomorrow. Who's on pre-op?" The final image was not of a victim or a symbol, but of a surgeon, Dr. Camille Johnson. Back in her element, her white coat a beacon of unwavering purpose under the cool, fluorescent lights of the surgical ward. She was a healer. She was a leader, and her purpose, forged in the crucible of humiliation and clarified by her own unwavering integrity, had never been clearer. The work of healing went on,